The marble floor of Apex Global gleamed like ice under the cold fluorescent lights. Thomas Wright moved his mop in slow, deliberate strokes, the rhythmic swish of water against stone the only sound in the vast executive lobby at 5:47 a.m. His dark hands, calloused and strong, gripped the wooden handle with the kind of precision that came from 20 years of invisible labor. Then the elevator chimed. Out stepped Cameron Sterling, billionaire CEO, youngest Forbes 30 under 30 honoree, and the man whose face graced the cover of every business magazine in the country. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the floor Thomas had just cleaned. He didn't look down. Men like Cameron never did. "You missed a spot," Cameron said, his voice sharp as broken glass. He pointed to a perfectly clean section of floor with his Mont Blanc pen, his mouth curling into something that resembled a smile but felt like a slap. Thomas looked up slowly, their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. "I'll get right on that, sir," Thomas said, his voice steady, betraying nothing. Cameron laughed, not a real laugh but the kind that came from a place of power, designed to remind everyone in earshot of their place in the world. 2 executives emerging from the elevator joined in, their laughter echoing off the walls like gunfire. "Make sure you do," Cameron said, adjusting his Tom Ford tie. "We can't have the help leaving messes around here, standards matter." He paused, looking Thomas up and down with theatrical disgust. "Even if some people clearly have none." As Cameron walked away, Thomas rolled down his sleeve. Just for a moment the fluorescent light had caught something on his forearm, a tattoo, faded and weathered by time. An eagle clutching an anchor, numbers, symbols that told a story Cameron Sterling would never think to ask about. Thomas returned to his mop. But beneath the silence, beneath the uniform of invisibility he wore every day, something ancient stirred, not anger but memory. If you think this is shocking already, wait until you hear the twist. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss it. Thomas Wright hadn't always pushed a mop through corporate towers. 23 years ago, he had stood on the deck of the USS Nimitz, salt spray in his face, the weight of command on his shoulders. Lieutenant Commander Wright, Navy SEAL, a man who had led rescue missions in hostile waters, who had pulled drowning sailors from burning wreckage, who had been awarded the Navy Cross for valor under fire. But that was before the accident. Before the helicopter went down off the coast of Somalia. Before the explosion that killed 3 of his men and shattered his left leg in 17 places. Before the medical discharge that came with a handshake, a medal, and no plan for what came next. He remembered holding his daughter Maya in the hospital, her small hand wrapped around his finger as the doctors explained he'd never serve again. She was 6 then. Her mother had left 2 years earlier, unable to handle the deployments, the silence, the man who came home different each time. "Daddy, does it hurt?" Maya had asked, her eyes wide with concern that no child should have to carry. "Not when you're here, baby girl," he'd said, forcing a smile through the morphine haze. Now Maya was in her 2nd year at Columbia University, pre-med, carrying a 3.9 GPA. Every dollar Thomas earned went toward keeping her there. Every night shift, every double shift, every moment of biting his tongue when men like Cameron Sterling looked through him as if he were glass, it was all for her. He kept a photo in his locker, Maya in her white coat from her anatomy lab, grinning with pride, holding up a stethoscope. On the back she'd written in her careful handwriting, "Because of you, Dad, everything because of you." Thomas didn't need respect from men in expensive suits. He'd earned respect in places where it actually meant something, where your brothers would die for you and you for them, where character was measured in action, not net worth. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn when his leg ached and his back screamed from hours of bending and lifting, he wondered if America remembered men like him at all. He'd decided long ago that it didn't matter. Dignity wasn't something someone could give you or take away. You carried it with you or you didn't. Thomas carried his like armor. Cameron Sterling had never earned anything he didn't inherit first. The company Apex Global, a multinational conglomerate worth $47 billion, had been built by his grandfather, a self-made steel magnate who'd clawed his way up from nothing. His father had expanded it into tech and real estate. And Cameron had been handed the keys at 28, along with a corner office on the 60th floor and expectations he could never quite meet. Every board meeting felt like an ambush. Every quarterly report was a test he was graded on by men twice his age who remembered when his grandfather ran things. They smiled to his face and whispered behind his back. "He's not Richard," they'd say. "He doesn't have his father's vision." So Cameron compensated the only way he knew how, with control, with dominance, with the performance of power that made him feel less like an imposter and more like the titan everyone expected him to be. He had learned early that respect in the corporate world wasn't given, it was taken. And if you couldn't command it through genius or innovation, you commanded it through fear, through reminders of hierarchy, through making sure everyone knew exactly where they stood in relation to you. The janitors, the assistants, the middle managers, they were background noise in Cameron's world, props in the story of his success. He barely registered their faces, never learned their names. They existed to serve, and he existed to be served. But lately, the pressure had been building, the board was circling, quarterly profits were down 3%. A hostile takeover bid was rumored. His father, retired in the Hamptons, had started making phone calls, just checking in, which really meant questioning every decision Cameron made. And this morning, after a sleepless night staring at spreadsheets that refused to balance, after his third wife had served him with divorce papers, after his therapist had suggested he might be having a crisis of purpose, Cameron had walked into that lobby needing to feel powerful. The janitor had simply been there. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong person to look at Cameron Sterling as if he were just another man. Cameron glanced at his reflection in the elevator's mirrored walls as he ascended to his office. Handsome, successful, untouchable. But somewhere, buried beneath the Armani suits and the carefully maintained image, was a small boy who had never been quite good enough for a father who'd built empires, and who knew, deep down, that he never would be. So he took it out on people who couldn't fight back. It was easier that way. Thomas finished mopping the lobby floor and pushed his cart toward the service elevator. His shift didn't end until 2 p.m. and there were 12 more floors to clean before then. His leg throbbed, the old injury always flared up when the weather changed, and today's forecast called for rain. As he waited for the elevator, he caught his reflection in the polished chrome doors. 51 years old, gray threading through his close-cropped hair. Lines carved deep around his eyes from years of squinting against the sun, first on naval vessels, now through the glare of fluorescent lights. He rolled up his sleeves to wash his hands at a nearby fountain, and there it was again, the tattoo that marked him as something more than what people saw. The eagle, wings spread wide, talons gripping an anchor. Beneath it, numbers, 218-2001, the date of his first deployment. And woven into the design, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, were the words, "Do Oppresso Liber **. To free the oppressed." The motto of the Army Special Forces, though Thomas had been Navy through and through. He'd gotten the tattoo after a joint operation in Afghanistan, a brotherhood mission with a Green Beret unit that had saved his life. They'd adopted him as an honorary member, and he'd worn their words ever since. But here, in this gleaming tower of wealth and corporate power, those words meant nothing. Or did they? Thomas rolled his sleeve back down and stepped into the service elevator. Behind him, Cameron Sterling's assistant rushed past, juggling 3 coffees and a stack of files, barely avoiding a collision. "Sorry," she gasped, her voice tight with stress. "You're fine," Thomas said gently, holding the elevator door open an extra moment so she wouldn't have to wait. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for a brief second Thomas saw recognition in her eyes. Not of who he was, but of what he represented, kindness in a place that had forgotten how to be kind. "Thank you," she whispered, and her voice cracked just slightly. Then the doors closed, and Thomas was alone with his thoughts. The tattoo burned under his sleeve, not with pain but with memory, with purpose. He'd freed the oppressed in Mogadishu, in Kandahar, in a dozen places whose names were still classified. He'd pulled innocent people from the rubble of war zones and carried them to safety. But who freed the oppressed here, in the heart of American prosperity, where the battle lines were drawn between the powerful and the powerless? Thomas pushed his cart down the hallway of the 7th floor, past framed photos of Cameron Sterling shaking hands with politicians and celebrities, past motivational posters about excellence and integrity that meant nothing to the people who actually kept this building running. He thought about Maya, studying late into the night, determined to become the doctor who helped people regardless of whether they could pay. She had learned that from him, not from his words but from his example. And as he emptied another trash can filled with half-eaten catered lunches that cost more than his daily wage, Thomas Wright made a decision. He would continue to endure, to survive, to carry his dignity like the shield it was. But he would also watch and wait. Because men who wielded cruelty carelessly always, eventually, created the circumstances of their own reckoning. 3 days later, Cameron Sterling called an emergency all-hands meeting in the main conference hall. The rumor mill had been churning, layoffs were coming, 20% of the workforce. The stock price had dropped 7 points after a disastrous earnings call and heads were going to roll. Thomas was cleaning the hallway outside the conference room when the doors burst open and employees began filing out. Their faces told the story, some pale with shock, others red with suppressed rage, a few openly crying. "Unbelievable," one middle-aged man muttered, clutching a brown cardboard box already filled with his desk belongings. 22 years, and he fires me with a PowerPoint slide." Cameron emerged last, flanked by his executive team, looking exhausted but resolute. He was saying something about necessary restructuring and positioning for future growth, his voice carrying that rehearsed quality of someone who'd been coached by PR professionals. Then he saw Thomas. And something in Cameron's face shifted, a flash of recognition, though not the kind that acknowledged humanity. It was the recognition of an object, a thing that had been present during his moment of casual cruelty days earlier. "You," Cameron said, stopping in the hallway. His executive stopped with him, creating an audience. Thomas straightened, meeting Cameron's gaze. "Sir." "The floors on the executive level," Cameron said, his voice loud enough to carry to the dozen employees still lingering nearby. "They're filthy. I don't know what we're paying you for, but it's certainly not for competent work." A lie. Thomas had cleaned those floors himself yesterday on his hands and knees, making sure every inch was spotless. "I'll address that immediately, sir," Thomas said, his voice calm. "Will you?" Cameron stepped closer, and now Thomas could smell the coffee on his breath, see the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of too much caffeine and too little sleep. "Because frankly, I'm wondering if we need to make some changes in facilities management too. Maybe your position should be on the chopping block next." The hallway went silent. One of the fired employees, a young woman Thomas recognized from the accounting department, looked horrified. An executive behind Cameron shifted uncomfortably. But Cameron wasn't finished. "Look at you," he said, gesturing at Thomas with open disdain. "How old are you? 50, 60, and this is where you ended up, pushing a mop. Tell me, is this what you imagined your life would be? Is this the height of your ambition?" Thomas felt the words land like blows, not because they hurt him but because they were designed to. Because Cameron Sterling needed, in this moment of his own failure and fear, to make someone else feel small so he could feel large. The old Thomas, the lieutenant commander who'd led men into combat, would have responded differently. But that man had learned through pain and sacrifice that some battles weren't worth fighting, that sometimes strength meant restraint. "We all do what we need to do, sir," Thomas said quietly. "I'm providing for my family. There's no shame in honest work." "Honest work?" Cameron repeated, laughing that same cruel laugh from days before. "Is that what you call it? I call it failure. I call it what happens when you don't have the intelligence or the drive to make something of yourself." He turned to his executives, performing now. "This is why America is falling behind, because we've created a culture where mediocrity is accepted, where people like this," he gestured at Thomas dismissively, "are content to be invisible, to contribute nothing." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. His hands, gripping the mop handle, tensed until his knuckles showed pale beneath his dark skin. But he didn't speak, didn't defend himself, didn't explain that the nothing he'd contributed included 3 Purple Hearts, 17 rescued hostages, and a daughter who would heal people for the rest of her life because he'd shown her what service meant. Instead, he simply nodded. "Will that be all, sir?" The question seemed to infuriate Cameron further, as if Thomas's refusal to break was itself an act of defiance. "Yes," Cameron snapped, "that will be all for now." He strode away, his executives following like ducklings, leaving Thomas standing in the hallway surrounded by witnesses to his humiliation. The young woman from accounting approached him, her eyes wet with tears, though Thomas suspected they weren't just for herself anymore. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, "you didn't deserve that." Thomas offered her a small smile, the kind that carried decades of perspective. "Neither did you, but we'll both be okay. The question is whether men like that ever will be." She nodded, not quite understanding, and walked away. Thomas returned to his cart. As he did, his sleeve rode up slightly, exposing the edge of his tattoo, the eagle's wing, the curve of the anchor. An executive who'd witnessed the entire exchange glanced down at it, his eyes widening slightly with sudden recognition. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, looking between Thomas and the direction Cameron had gone. But he said nothing. And Thomas moved on to the next floor, carrying his dignity like the weapon it was, quiet, unbreakable, and far more powerful than Cameron Sterling would ever understand. If this part has you on edge, hit the like button right now. It lets us know you want more stories like this. That night, Thomas sat in his small apartment in Queens, icing his leg and scrolling through his phone. Maya had sent him a text earlier. "Dad just aced my pathology exam, top score in the class. Thinking of you, love you." He smiled, texting back a string of heart emojis and congratulations, when his phone rang. A known number. Thomas almost didn't answer, but something made him swipe to accept. "Is this Thomas Wright?" A man's voice, older, with the gravelly quality of someone who'd spent a lifetime shouting orders. "Who's asking?" "Admiral Richard Castellano, U.S. Naval Special Warfare Command, retired." Thomas sat up straighter, ignoring the protest from his leg. "Admiral Castellano, it's been a long time, sir." "Too long, Commander?" The use of his old rank sent a jolt through Thomas's chest. "I'm calling because your name came across my desk this week. Apparently you're working as a janitor at Apex Global in Manhattan. That true?" Thomas hesitated. "Yes, sir, it pays the bills." "And apparently their CEO is Cameron Sterling." A pause, heavy with meaning. "Does that name mean anything to you, son?" Thomas frowned. "Just my boss's boss's boss, sir." "Why?" "Because Cameron Sterling's grandfather, Richard Sterling, served in Korea, decorated combat veteran, Silver Star. He built Apex Global from nothing, a true American success story." "I didn't know that, sir." His son, Cameron's father, also served, Navy pilot, not with distinction, but he served. "But Cameron," the admiral's voice hardened. "Cameron bought his way out of his draft number during the tail end of operations in Iraq, family connections, medical deferment that was complete bullshit. The kid's never done anything but spend money other people earned." Thomas listened, not sure where this was going. "Here's the thing, Wright," the admiral continued. "Sterling's grandfather left specific instructions in his will, instructions that were sealed for 15 years and just became legally accessible last month. Those instructions involve you." Thomas's heart began to pound. "Sir, I don't understand." "Richard Sterling knew your father, Thomas. They served together in Vietnam. Your father, Sergeant Major James Wright, saved Richard Sterling's life during the Tet Offensive. Carried him 3 miles through enemy territory with a bullet in his own shoulder." Thomas's breath caught. His father had died when he was 12. Complications from Agent Orange exposure. He'd rarely spoken about his service. "Sterling never forgot that debt," the admiral said. "And before he died 5 years ago, he set up a trust, a substantial trust, for the descendants of James Wright. The conditions were specific. The beneficiary had to have served honorably in the U.S. military and be currently employed at Apex Global." The room seemed to tilt. "Thomas, you're about to inherit a controlling interest in Apex Global, 33% of the company's shares, valued at approximately $15 billion. Thomas couldn't breathe, couldn't think. That's impossible." "It's not only possible, it's already in motion. The lawyers are finalizing the paperwork now. In 72 hours you'll be notified officially. And son," the admiral's voice softened, "Richard Sterling left a letter for you too. He wanted you to know that he never forgot what your father did, that he built his empire on the foundation of that debt, and that he wanted you, not his spoiled grandson, to have the power to honor your father's legacy." The phone call ended. Thomas sat in the darkness of his apartment, staring at the photo of Maya on his refrigerator, at the flag folded in a triangle on his bookshelf, the one they'd given him at his father's funeral. And on his forearm, beneath his rolled-up sleeve, the tattoo seemed to burn with new meaning. Do Oppresso Liber. To free the oppressed. In 72 hours, Thomas Wright would walk into Apex Global not as a janitor, but as its second-largest shareholder. And Cameron Sterling, the man who'd mocked him, humiliated him, and tried to make him feel worthless, had no idea what was coming. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat at his small kitchen table, the Admiral's words echoing in his mind like sonar pings in dark water. $15 billion, controlling interest. His father's legacy reaching across decades to touch him now in this moment when he'd been ground down to almost nothing. But it wasn't the money that kept him awake. It was the weight of what it meant, the responsibility, the power to change lives or destroy them. He looked at his hands, these hands that had gripped rifle barrels and steering wheels of rescue boats, that had pulled dying men from helicopter wreckage, that now pushed a mop across marble floors. These same hands would soon sign documents that would shift the balance of an empire. His phone buzzed, a text from Maya. Can't sleep, too excited about my exam, you still up? He smiled, typing back, always up when you need me, baby girl. Her response came immediately, I know, Dad, I know. Thomas made himself coffee and watched the sunrise through his narrow window, painting the Queen's skyline in shades of gold and crimson. In 71 hours, everything would change. But first he had a shift to work. The emergency began at 11:47 a.m. on Tuesday. Thomas was on the 42nd floor cleaning the executive conference room when the fire alarm exploded into sound, a violent, pulsing shriek that made his combat instincts snap to attention. But this wasn't a drill. The lights flickered. The ventilation system coughed out a plume of acrid black smoke. Through the glass walls of the conference room, Thomas saw chaos erupt. Employees poured from offices, running toward the stairwells, their faces twisted with panic. Someone screamed. Papers scattered in the air like panicked birds. Thomas moved to the door, his training taking over. Assess, prioritize, act. The smoke was coming from the east wing where the server rooms were located. Electrical fire, probably. The sprinkler system should have activated, but nothing was coming down. Malfunction. He grabbed his radio. This is Wright Facilities. I have eyes on smoke. East wing, 42nd floor. Sprinklers are not responding. Repeat, sprinklers are not responding. Static. Then the security supervisor's voice, tight with stress. Wright, evacuate immediately. Fire department is en route. All personnel must exit the building. Copy that, Thomas said, but he was already moving toward the smoke, not away from it. Because through the haze, he'd heard something that froze his blood. A voice, high-pitched, terrified, a child's voice. Help, someone help us. Thomas ran. The smoke thickened as he pushed through the east corridor, his eyes burning, his old legs screaming in protest. He pulled his shirt over his nose and mouth, squinting through the darkness. The heat was building fast. This wasn't a small fire. This was going to blow. Where are you? He shouted. Here, we're in here. The voice came from behind a door marked Executive Lounge, Private Access. Thomas tried the handle, locked, electronic lock, and the power was flickering. He slammed his shoulder into it once, twice. On the third impact, something gave way and the door burst open. Inside, huddled against the far wall, were two children, a boy about 8 years old and a girl maybe 6, and Cameron Sterling's assistant, the same woman who'd nearly collided with Thomas days earlier. She was cradling both children, her face streaked with tears and soot. The door locked behind us, she gasped. The kids, they're the CEO's nephew and niece. I was supposed to be watching them during the board meeting, but the fire. Can you walk? Thomas cut her off, his voice calm, authoritative, the voice of a commander. She nodded. Then we move. Now stay low, follow me, don't let go of those kids. Thomas led them back into the corridor, but the smoke had doubled in the seconds he'd been inside the lounge. The sprinklers suddenly burst to life, but it was too little, too late. Flames licked out from an office doorway ahead, blocking the path to the main stairwell. The kids were coughing, struggling to breathe. The assistant stumbled, her knees buckling. Thomas made a decision. He scooped up both children, one under each arm, ignoring the agony in his leg, and turned to the assistant. "Can you make it to the service elevator? The elevators are supposed to be." "Can you make it?" he repeated, his voice brooking no argument. She nodded, finding some reserve of strength. They ran through the smoke, Thomas's body operating on pure muscle memory, the way it had in Mogadishu, in Kandahar, in every hellhole where death had tried to claim him and failed. The service elevator was 30 yards away. 20, 10. Behind them, something exploded, a transformer or server bank detonating in a shower of sparks and flame. The shockwave threw them forward, and Thomas twisted his body mid-fall to shield the children, taking the impact on his shoulder and back. Pain whited out his vision for a moment, but he was already moving, already pushing up, already reaching for the elevator butts. The doors opened. They tumbled inside, and Thomas slammed his hand on the ground floor button. As the elevator descended, he looked down at the children in his arms. The girl was crying silently, her small body shaking. The boy stared at him with wide, shocked eyes. "You're okay," Thomas said softly, his voice cutting through their terror. "I've got you, you're going to be just fine." The girl wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder. "Are you a superhero?" she whispered. Thomas felt something break open in his chest, not pain but something far more dangerous: hope. "No, sweetheart," he said, "just a man who made a promise to always help people who need it." The elevator reached the ground floor, and the doors opened to a scene of controlled chaos. Firefighters were pouring into the building, EMTs were setting up triage stations, and Cameron Sterling stood in the center of it all, his face ashen, screaming into his phone. "I don't care what it takes, find them, my sister's kids are up there, find them." Then he looked up and saw Thomas emerge from the elevator, covered in soot and blood, carrying his niece and nephew. Time stopped. Cameron ran forward, his expensive shoes slipping on the wet marble. He reached for the children, and Thomas carefully transferred them into his arms. They clung to their uncle, sobbing now that safety was real. "Oh God," Cameron breathed, crushing them against his chest. "Oh God, thank you, thank you." Then he looked at Thomas, really looked at him, and for the first time Cameron Sterling saw the man standing before him. An EMT approached, trying to check Thomas's injuries, and in the movement, Thomas's sleeve tore where it had caught on a piece of metal during the fall. The tattoo was fully visible now, the eagle, the anchor, the numbers, and beneath it all those words in faded ink: "Do Oppresso Liber **." One of the firefighters, a grizzled captain with 30 years on the job, froze mid-stride. His eyes locked on the tattoo, then moved to Thomas's face. "Holy shit," the captain whispered, then louder, "You're Thomas Wright, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Wright." Thomas met his gaze and gave a small nod. The captain's voice carried across the lobby, silencing the chaos. "This man is a goddamn Navy Cross recipient. He pulled 16 sailors from a burning ship off the coast of Yemen. He's a hero, a real one." Cameron's face went through a series of transformations: confusion, disbelief, then dawning horror as memory caught up with reality. The janitor he'd mocked, the man he'd threatened to fire, the person he'd called a failure, mediocre, worthless. Around them, other firefighters and EMTs who'd served in the military began to recognize Thomas, murmuring among themselves. A young cop approached, his hand extended, his eyes shining with something close to worship. "Sir, I served in the Navy. I've heard stories about you, about Somalia, about the rescue. It's an honor." Thomas shook his hand, uncomfortable with the attention. "Just did my job, son, same as you do every day." But Cameron was still staring, his mind clearly reeling. His sister, a woman Thomas had never met, burst through the crowd and swept her children into her arms, tears streaming down her face. When she learned who'd saved them, she turned to Thomas with trembling gratitude. "How can I ever thank you?" she asked. "No thanks necessary, ma'am," Thomas said quietly. "I'm just glad they're safe." Cameron's assistant, being treated by an EMT, spoke up, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "He ran into the fire when everyone else was running out. He didn't hesitate. He saved all 3 of us." The crowd had grown now, employees who'd evacuated, news cameras arriving, the gathering weight of witnesses to something that couldn't be unsaid or undone. And then a black town car pulled up to the curb and three men in expensive suits stepped out, carrying leather portfolios. The lead attorney, gray-haired, distinguished with the bearing of someone used to delivering life-changing news, approached Thomas. "Mr. Wright, Thomas Wright." "That's me," Thomas said, confused. "We've been trying to reach you. We represent the estate of Richard Sterling, founder of Apex Global." He glanced at Cameron, whose face had gone from pale to ghostly white. "We have documents that require your immediate attention and signature." "Documents?" Cameron's voice cracked. "What documents?" The attorney turned to him with professional courtesy that barely masked something like satisfaction. "Mr. Sterling, your grandfather's sealed will has been executed as of this morning. 33% of Apex Global's shares, controlling interest when combined with other minority stakeholders, has been transferred to Mr. Thomas Wright in recognition of a debt of honor owed to his late father, Sergeant Major James Wright." The lobby went silent except for the sound of water still dripping from the sprinkler system. Cameron looked like he'd been struck. That's impossible. My grandfather would never." "Your grandfather specifically arranged it," the attorney interrupted. "With conditions. Mr. Wright had to have served honorably in the U.S. military and be currently employed by this company. He met both requirements as of 72 hours ago when the trust became active." He turned back to Thomas. "Sir, as of this moment, you are the second largest shareholder in Apex Global. You have the authority to call board meetings, review all company decisions, and effectively operate as a check on executive power." Thomas stood there, covered in soot and blood, his leg throbbing, his hands still shaking from adrenaline, and processed what this meant. He looked at Cameron Sterling, this man who'd spent days crushing him, who'd mocked his dignity, who'd threatened his livelihood, and saw not an enemy but a broken human being who'd never learned what real strength looked like. The news cameras were rolling now, capturing everything. Thomas was aware of the moment's weight of how this could go in a dozen different directions. He could humiliate Cameron, could destroy him with a single statement, could take everything he'd been denied and watch this man crumble. But that wasn't who Thomas Wright was. He stepped closer to Cameron, close enough that the cameras couldn't hear, and spoke in a voice only the two of them could share. "Your grandfather built something remarkable," Thomas said. "And he built it on a foundation of honor, because my father gave him a second chance at life. That's the legacy you inherited, Cameron, not just money or power but responsibility. The responsibility to remember where you came from and to lift up the people who keep this place running." Cameron's eyes were red, whether from smoke or tears, Thomas couldn't tell. I don't understand. I treated you like garbage. I tried to humiliate you. Why did you save my family?" "Because that's what you do when someone needs help," Thomas said simply. "It's not about whether they deserve it, it's about whether you're the kind of person who can live with yourself if you walk away." Cameron's voice broke. "I'm so sorry, God, I'm so sorry for everything I said, everything I—" Thomas held up a hand. "I'm not interested in apologies right now, I'm interested in change, real change." He glanced back at the crowd of employees watching from behind the police tape, people who'd been fired days ago, people who'd been treated as disposable. "Your grandfather left me this power for a reason. He wanted me to make sure Apex Global remembered what it stands for, what it should stand for." "What do you want me to do?" Cameron asked, and there was something raw in his voice now, something that sounded almost like hope. "I want you to learn," Thomas said. "Learn what it means to serve instead of rule. Learn what your grandfather knew, that the measure of a man isn't his bank account or his title. It's how he treats people when no one's watching, when it costs him something to be kind." He stepped back, addressing Cameron at full volume now, aware the cameras would catch this. "I'm accepting this inheritance," Thomas announced. "And my first official act as a major shareholder will be to establish an employee council, real representation for every person who works here, from executives to facilities staff. We're going to rebuild this company on the principles your grandfather intended. On honor, on respect, on the understanding that every person who walks through these doors has value." He looked directly at Cameron. "And you're going to help me do it, not because you have to, but because you're going to choose to, because somewhere inside you is the man your grandfather hoped you'd become. You just forgot how to find him." Cameron stood there, his expensive suit ruined, his face streaked with ash and tears, looking smaller and younger than he had any right to be. And then he nodded. "Okay," he whispered, "okay, teach me." 6 months later, Thomas Wright stood in the newly dedicated Richard Sterling Memorial Hall, a community center built on the ground floor of Apex Global, open to the public, offering job training, veteran services, and educational programs for underprivileged kids. Maya stood beside him, home for spring break, her hand clasped in his. She'd been accepted to Johns Hopkins for medical school with a full scholarship, though she didn't need it anymore. Thomas had insisted she keep it, let it go to someone else who needed the door opened. Cameron Sterling stood at the podium addressing a crowd of employees, community members, and press. He looked different now, older somehow, but in a way that suggested wisdom rather than weariness. 6 months ago, I almost lost the only thing that truly mattered, my family. And I was saved by a man I'd spent days trying to destroy. A man whose humility taught me more about leadership than my entire business school education. Cameron paused, his voice steady but emotional. My grandfather built this company with his hands and his courage, but he built it on a foundation laid by Sergeant Major James Wright, who carried him to safety when he had every reason to leave him behind. That legacy of service, of sacrifice, of choosing others over yourself, that's what Apex Global will stand for from this day forward. He gestured to Thomas. And the man who saved my family that day, who could have used his new power to humiliate me, who instead chose to teach me, he embodies everything this company should be. The applause was genuine, warm. After the ceremony, Thomas found himself standing by the memorial wall, photos of veterans who'd worked at Apex over the decades, including a newly uncovered portrait of his father in his dress uniform, young and proud and alive in a way Thomas barely remembered. The young woman from accounting, rehired with a promotion, approached him shyly. "Mr. Wright, I just wanted to say thank you, not just for my job but for showing us that good people still exist, that doing the right thing still matters." Thomas smiled at her. It always mattered, we just forget sometimes when we're scared or hurting or trying to survive, but it's never too late to remember who we're supposed to be. As the sun set through the windows of the memorial hall, Thomas watched children, kids from the neighborhood, kids who looked like he had once upon a time, running through the space, laughing, dreaming, believing that maybe the world had room for them after all. Cameron approached, quieter now, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Thomas. "I've been meeting with the employee council," Cameron said, "listening more than talking, learning about people's lives, their struggles." He shook his head. "I was so focused on proving I was worthy of my grandfather's name that I forgot to ask what that name actually meant." "And now," Thomas asked. "Now I'm trying to earn it, every day, one decision at a time." Cameron looked at him. "You could have taken everything from me, why didn't you?" Thomas sipped his coffee, thinking about the question, about Somalia and burning helicopters and the men he'd lost, about Maya and her dreams, about his father who'd carried a stranger to safety and never asked for recognition. "Because destroying you wouldn't have fixed anything," Thomas said finally. "Because my father taught me not with words but with his life that the strongest thing you can do is help someone else stand up, even if they knocked you down first." Cameron nodded slowly, and in his eyes Thomas saw the beginning of something real. Not redemption, exactly, that would take years, maybe a lifetime, but the willingness to try, the courage to face what you'd been and choose to become something better. "Thank you," Cameron said quietly, "for not giving up on me." Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. "Nobody gave up on me when I needed it, just passing it forward." As Thomas walked out of Apex Global that evening, no longer as a janitor but as a man who'd transformed an empire by refusing to forget his humanity, he thought about the tattoo on his arm. "Do Oppresso Liber. To free the oppressed." He'd spent his life living those words in war zones and rescue missions, in places where freedom meant life or death. But he'd learned something in these past months. The oppressed weren't just people trapped by violence or tyranny. They were also people trapped by their own cruelty, their own fear, their own desperate need to prove they mattered by making others feel small. Sometimes the greatest act of liberation wasn't pulling someone from rubble or carrying them from a burning building. Sometimes it was showing them they didn't have to keep carrying the weight of their own worst choices. That they could set it down, they could change, they could choose in this moment and every moment after to be the person they were always meant to be. Thomas Wright had learned long ago that falling didn't make you weak. Staying down did. And the truest measure of strength wasn't how high you could climb or how much power you could hoard. It was whether you reached back down to help others rise. Because the people we overlook, the janitors, the assistants, the invisible ones who keep the world turning, they're not background noise in someone else's success story. They're the heroes we forgot to recognize. And sometimes, all it takes to change everything is remembering to see them.